You are paying for a war every time you buy groceries. Not someday, not indirectly. Right now, every swipe of your card at the supermarket is quietly funding a global conflict, not through taxes, but through prices added to your food, and most people have no idea it is happening. You feel it at the checkout, the total is higher than you expected. You stare at the receipt, trying to understand how basic food suddenly became so expensive. Bread costs more, eggs cost more, even simple items don't feel simple anymore. You told it as just inflation. But what if a big part of that price shock didn't start in your city or even your country, but thousands of miles away in the middle of a war zone? That's the part most people never hear. The war in Ukraine doesn't stay on the battlefield. Its economic shockwaves move through global markets, shipping routes, energy systems, and farms, and by the time those shocks reach you, they don't look like war anymore. They look like a higher grocery bill. If you eat bread, pasta, or cereal, this will hit you first. Long before headlines talked about inflation, the damage started in a place often called the breadbasket of Europe. Before the war, Ukraine and Russia together supplied a massive share of the world's wheat and barley. When fighting began, Black Sea ports were blocked almost overnight, ships stopped moving, insurance rates exploded, buyers panicked. Think of it like shutting down a major highway without warning. Nothing moves, everyone scrambles. Wheat prices surged fast, and when a basic ingredient jumps, everything made from it follows. Bread, cereal, pasta, baked goods. That price shock didn't stay overseas. It moved straight into grocery stores around the world, including yours. And here's what most people miss: even after grain prices cooled, the system never went back to normal. Shipping routes were permanently rerouted, insurance costs stayed higher, suppliers built in extra margins to protect against the next disruption. That extra risk didn't disappear. It became part of the price you pay every week. So even when headlines say prices are stabilizing, your grocery bill doesn't feel that way. And this is only the most obvious connection. Because grain is just the beginning, the next cost is even harder to see, but it's built into almost everything you eat. Most of the cost of your food is decided long before anything is harvested. And it starts with something you never see at the grocery store: fertilizer. Modern farming depends on it. Without fertilizer, crop yields collapse. And one of the largest suppliers of fertilizer ingredients on earth is Russia. When the war began and sanctions hit, that supply was suddenly disrupted. Prices didn't just rise, they spiked. Farmers in the US opened invoices that were double what they paid before, sometimes more. This wasn't optional. You can grow food at scale without fertilizer. And here's the part that quietly locks the cost in. Farmers don't eat that loss. They can their margins are already thin, so the extra cost moves forward. It gets built into the price of corn, then soy, then wheat, and then it shows up everywhere else, because those crops don't just feed people. They feed animals, cows, chickens, pigs. So when fertilizer gets expensive, vegetables cost more. But meat, eggs, and dairy quietly follow. This is where the war stops feeling distant, because now it's not just bread or pasta. It's your protein, your breakfast, your kids' lunches, and most people never connected back to fertilizer. Even now, prices haven't fully reset. They've come down from the peak, but they raise still higher than they were before the war. Farmers have learned to expect volatility, suppliers' price, and risk. That risk doesn't disappear, it stays embedded in the food system. And this is where things start to compound, because fertilizer doesn't just cost more to buy, it also costs more to move. And that brings us to the next pressure point most people underestimate: energy. Almost everything you buy at the grocery store is powered by energy. And when energy prices spike, food prices follow whether you notice it or not. When the war in Ukraine began, global oil and gas markets went into shock. Sanctions, supply fears, and uncertainty pushed energy prices sharply higher. Gas stations were the most visible reminder, but that was only the surface. Because energy doesn't just get you to the store, it runs the entire food system. Diesel fuels the tractors that plant and harvest crops. It powers the trucks that move food across the country. Natural gas runs the factories that process and package it. Electricity keeps warehouses cold and grocery aisles refrigerated. So when energy costs surge, every single step gets more expensive at once. And here's the part most people don't realize: This isn't a cost tied to one ingredient, it isn't everything cost. When fuel and power prices jumped in IRR, food producers didn't raise prices once, they raised them everywhere: transportation, processing, storage, distribution. Those costs stacked on top of grain prices, on top of fertilizer prices. And by the time food reached the shelf, the increase looked mysterious. But it wasn't even now. As energy prices move up and down, the baseline is higher than it used to be. Companies lock in fuel contracts, shipping rates adjust, long-term costs get baked in. That's why food prices don't fall as fast as gas prices do. The system remembers the shock. And once energy becomes unpredictable, everyone in the chain adds a buffer. Not because they greedy, because they afraid of the next spike. That fear becomes part of the price. And this is where the war's impact stops being temporary, because when businesses plan for instability, they plan for higher prices, and that sets the stage for something even harder to untangle: the supply chain itself. By the time food shortages show up in your grocery store, the real damage has already happened somewhere else. Long before prices change, the supply chain starts breaking. When the war in Ukraine began, it didn't just block ships in the Black Sea, it scrambled global trade routes that had been carefully optimized for decades. Cargo that once moved directly now had to take longer, more expensive paths, insurance costs jumped, delays became normal. And here's the part most people never see: Ukraine isn't just a grain exporter. It is a key supplier of ingredients used in thousands of everyday foods. Sunflower oil is one of them. It is in snacks, frozen foods, baked goods, sauces. When that supply vanished, manufacturers didn't stop producing. They scrambled for alternatives: palm oil, soybean oil. Those substitutes were already in demand. Prices surged, and manufacturers locked in higher costs just to keep shelves stocked. That scramble didn't stop with ingredients. Packaging became harder to get, aluminum costs rose, plastics became more expensive, shipping containers were scarce. Every delay added another fee, every reroute added another markup. And none of this happens in isolation. Food processors in the US don't absorb these costs. They can their contracts are built around predictable inputs. When predictability disappears, prices adjust upward to compensate. So even foods that never touched Ukraine were affected. Not because of scarcity, but because the system itself became more fragile. And when a system becomes fragile, everyone prices in protection. That protection looks like higher prices on the shelf. Even now, long after the initial shock, those adjustments haven't been undone. Supply chains were redesigned for resilience, not efficiency. That means redundancy, extra steps, extra costs. And those costs don't vanish when headlines move on. They become permanent. And once the system is operating under constant stress, something else begins to happen quietly in the background. Money itself starts getting more expensive, and that's where the war's impact takes another turn. Even when food becomes easier to find, it can still keep getting more expensive, because at a certain point, the problem isn't supply anymore, it's money. The shocks from the war didn't just raise prices for grain, fertilizer, and energy, they poured fuel on inflation that was already building. And by inflation hit levels the US hadn't seen in decades. So the Federal Reserve stepped in. Interest rates went up fast. That move was supposed to slow the economy down. But here's what almost no one connects to their grocery bill: higher interest rates make money more expensive for everyone, including the companies that sell you food. Your grocery store doesn't run on cash. Neither do food distributors, processors, or packaging companies. They rely on loans to buy inventory, finance equipment, and manage day-to-day operations. When rates rise, those loans cost more, and that extra cost doesn't stay on a balance sheet. It moves forward. It gets quietly added to the price of canned food, to pasta, to frozen meals, to snacks. This is why prices don't fall just because wheat or fuel prices ease. Businesses are still paying more just to operate, borrowing costs stay high, financing stays tight, and once companies raise prices to cover those costs, they rarely rush to lower them. Here's the uncomfortable part. From the outside, it looks like inflation has cooled, but underneath, the system is still carrying war-related debt, higher interest payments, and tighter credit. So even when shelves are full, the pressure on prices doesn't disappear. It just becomes harder to see. And when higher rates collide with everything we've already talked about, energy, fertilizer, shipping, something dangerous happens. Small shocks turn into big ones, which is exactly why one specific food category exploded in price almost overnight: eggs. And what happened there shows how fragile the system really is. Egg prices didn't rise for just one reason. They exploded because several crises hit at the same time. Most people remember the headline explanation: avian flu. Millions of hens were lost, and supply dropped fast. That was real, but it wasn't the whole story. Here is the part that stayed mostly invisible. The war in Ukraine had already pushed up the cost of chicken feed. Corn and soy were more expensive because fertilizer costs were higher. Energy prices were still elevated, making it more expensive to heat barns, run equipment, and transport eggs to market. So when the avian flu hit, farmers weren't just dealing with fewer birds. They were dealing with the highest operating costs they'd ever seen. Feed cost more, fuel cost more, electricity cost more. At the exact moment supply collapsed, that combination is what sent egg prices into shock territory. And once prices jump that far, they don't snap back quickly. Producers lock in contracts, retailers adjust expectations. Everyone assumes volatility is the new normal. This is how a single crisis turns into a multiplier. The disease created the shortage, the war made it expensive. Together, they turned a temporary problem into a price spike that lingered long after the headlines faded. And eggs weren't unique. Poultry, dairy, meat, all of them sit at the intersection of feed, energy, and transport. When those inputs are unstable, prices become fragile. And that fragility changes behavior. Producers start planning for disruption instead of efficiency. They raise prices to build a cushion against the next shock. Which brings us to the final mechanism most people don't realize they're living with now. The idea that prices might never go back to where they were, and why that matters more than any single war. Once prices rise high enough, something changes. They stop behaving the way you expect them to. Economists call it sticky prices. But the idea is simple. When businesses go through repeated shocks, they stop believing lower prices will last. So even when costs ease, they keep prices elevated as protection. And the war in Ukraine triggered exactly that kind of fear. Energy became unpredictable. Shipping routes felt fragile. Inputs like fertilizer and grain looked unreliable overnight. So food companies adjusted their mindset. Instead of asking, "How low can we price this?" they started asking, "How do we protect ourselves if this happens again?" That shift matters more than any single shortage, because once a higher price becomes normal, it stops being temporary. Even as inflation slows, food prices remain dramatically higher than they were before the war, not because companies forgot how to lower prices, but because uncertainty has been priced in. This is why your grocery bill doesn't fall the way gas prices sometimes do. Food systems move cautiously, contracts are long-term, margins are guarded. And after years of overlapping crises, no one wants to be caught unprepared, so prices stick. They settle at a new plateau, not because the war is happening every day in your kitchen, but because the system learned something during the war, that instability is expensive. And once a system decides instability is permanent, the cost becomes permanent too. So when you stand at the checkout and feel that familiar shock, it isn't just about inflation, or one bad year, or one bad decision. It is the accumulated cost of a global system reshaped by conflict. Understanding that won't lower your bill tomorrow, but it does answer the question almost everyone is asking: why does food still feel so expensive? Because long after the fighting fades from the headlines, the economic ripples keep moving, and now, they live in your grocery cart.